Hello again, welcome to DotVVM Virtual Conference. Welcome to the second session. This time I will be talking about the MVVM pattern and how you should write your view models in complicated applications. So let's start right now. So first maybe I should explain what exactly Model-View-ViewModel is and what all the words in this complicated term mean. So for maybe the most problematic part is the model, because in every book you can find different definitions of this term, but I understand model as a business layer API. It doesn't mean to be API, a real API. It's just what the business layer gives to you, and not only the functionality, also the data models. So if you get information about customer, it's also what fields are included with this object. So for me, the model is basically what the business layer gives me and what accepts from me when I need to do something. Yeah, so something like this. Then there is the view. So in case of .vvm, there is just the .dot.html file. We also support the master pages, and we also support user control. So there are also other extensions that should be also considered as a view. So dot master and dot control. Yeah. But the syntax in all those files is pretty much the same. The extension is only to distinguish between kinds of the views. And the view model in case of .vvm is just a C# class, which shouldn't contain business logic. It should contain the presentation logic. So for example, saving and loading the customers from the database, it's not a matter of the view models, because view model is a part of the presentation layer. This logic should be somewhere else in some service or facade or repository or something like that. And the view model should only say, okay, I need information about customer, somebody give them to me. Yeah, so it's very important not to place business logic basically in the presentation layer, because this also prevents the application from being extended, and it creates basically technological debt, and it's difficult to, for example, upgrade to newer platforms or to change the front end for something else, because you are not only rewriting front end, you also need to rewrite or remove out the business logic. The view model in .vvm has several responsibilities. The most important is to represent the state of the user interface. So you have seen this in the previous session where I had the calculator, and we needed to represent those numbers that were entered by the user in the view model. So for every piece of information that is dynamic in the page and that somebody, not only the user, even somebody else, can change, everything like that has to be represented in the view model, and it should be public properties. It's important for .vvm that these properties are public, and it have to be properties, not fields. Then the second responsibility of the view model is to handle the user commands. So whenever the user does something with the page, or whenever the user orders some action to be done, the view model is the guy who will receive this event and who is responsible for handling it. So when you click the button, a method in the view model is called. So for handling commands, you should use public methods in the view model, and .vvm supports both synchronous or asynchronous methods. So the method can be void or it can be async task. Maybe the async is not necessary. I just wanted to emphasize that it's asynchronous. So if the method returns a task, .vvm will await this task. Also, an optional thing that the view model can do is the navigation between the pages. View model can redirect the user to another page or to another route, to be precise. You don't need to use this sometimes because you are still in the HTML, so you can create a hyperlink to another page. And I was also showing the route link control. So these controls can basically bypass the view model. You can go from one view directly to another view. But if you, for example, want to save the data and then send the user somewhere, you can use redirect, and in this case the view model will handle the navigation throughout the application. So it's an optional feature, but it's there and you can use it. And I already explained how DotVVM works, and I said that DotVVM takes the view model and serializes it and sends it to the browser. So the condition for view model in DotVVM is that it must be JSON serializable. Yeah. And also the state must be part of this JSON. That's why we require public properties. If it's not a public property, if it's, for example, a private variable or private field in the view model, it wouldn't be included in the JSON, so the state information would be lost. That's why you need to use public properties, and for commands we are using public methods. So that's it. And the view model on the server, there are some methods in the view model that can be called, and they are called in this order. So first we have the init method, which is called right after the view model is created. Yeah. And in the previous animation, there was that if you send a post back, so if you click a button, the DotVVM will take the view model, serialize it in JSON, and send it to the server. Then we just first create a new empty view model, and then we take the JSON and populate the view model with the JSON. And it's after the init method. So in init, you typically want to load static information, non-changing data, something like, I don't know, list of countries, or list of currencies, or some constants, or some application settings and things like that. Things that never change, because you don't have the current information, the current state from the user. This state is available in the load method. So in load method, you have the view model in a consistent form. It's in exact state as the user is seeing it right now on the post back. And then the method which user choose to be called will be invoked. So the calculate method would be invoked after the load event. And then there is the pre-render event, which is the one you will be overriding most of the time, because it's done after the user command. And typically in this method, you want to request new data from the database and fill, for example, the grid view or something like that. It's important to do it after the command, because if the command is, for example, creating or deleting some data, if you would do the select before the command, you wouldn't get the most current results. Yeah? So that's why you should do most of the database work in the pre-render. Yeah? So this naming is taken from web forms. We wanted to keep it similar to web forms, but the load, do not load data in load the data in pre-render. I know it's a little bit confusing, but if you have been working with web forms, you probably know the reasons why it's not a good idea to load the data in load. I will show you a short example of how to do the most frequent requirement, which is a CRUD page. So a page where you can create, read, update, and delete your records. In DotVVM, there is the GridView control, which supports sorting and paging, and it doesn't support filtering right away, but it's very easy to add it, so you will see how to do it. And you can use the classic collections like lists or array with the GridView, but you would need to handle the sorting and paging by yourself. That's why DotVVM includes a class which is called GridView dataset. And this class is basically a collection with some metadata about sorting and paging. So it's a collection which also remembers on which page you are and by which field you are sorting, for example. There are some other features to the GridView dataset, but these two are the most frequently used. And the GridView dataset, it has also support for iQueryable. So if you are using, for example, Entity Framework, it's loading the data in the GridView dataset is very easy. There is just one method called dataset load from queryable, and you will give queryable to the dataset and it will do all the loading for you. If you don't use Entity Framework, or if you want to use any other way of getting data, you can also fill the dataset manually. It supports both scenarios, so it's up to you if you want to use Entity Framework or if you want to load the dataset manually. Also, there is a very important feature in DotVVM which you can take advantage of, and it's a DataContext property. In the previous session, you have seen that you can use the value binding to read and write values from the ViewModel. So you can bind the text box text property to some property in the ViewModel, and the data binding works in both ways. So whenever the value is changed in the ViewModel, the text box will be updated, and whenever the user enters something in the text box, it will be written to the ViewModel. So by default, this binding is two-way. And if the ViewModel is more complicated, you probably don't want to have 20 properties in the ViewModel, so you can use nesting. And if you nest one ViewModel into the other, you can use the data context, so all your bindings would be evaluated not to the root ViewModel of the page, but only to some specific part of the ViewModel, basically to some ViewModel child. Yeah? So this is how you can restrict some part of the page to work only with some part of the ViewModel. And if you use this correctly, it's a great thing because it can make your markup much more concise. So let's look how it works. I will run the application first. I have a Northwind SQLite database, so it's very easy to start. You don't need to configure a SQL server or anything like that. You can just get the source code and run the project. And I'm using Bootstrap, so this looks nice. If I would do my own design, it would look very ugly, I promise. So this is a GridView control, which is just using a few Bootstrap classes, so it would look nice. By default, DotVVM just produce a raw HTML table, and you have to provide your own CSS to make it look like a table. But Bootstrap is doing a great job in this. And you can see there is a one page of records. There are 15 rows, and you can use the paging. So I'm clicking through all the pages, and there is sorting, so I can sort. And because I'm using iQueryable, so the database is not queried for all the pages, so I'm not loading million records from the database. I'm just loading the current page because the dataset can add these paging and sorting information right in the iQueryable query. So if you use Entity Framework, it would be very efficient. You will just load these records. There are a lot of technologies that need to load the entire table and then doing the paging on the client side, but in DotVVM this is done for you, so it's very efficient. Okay. And if you look in this page, it's quite easy. We have the GridView control, which is bound to a product, and I will show the ViewModel in a few seconds. And I'm using the Bootstrap CSS classes, so this is table striped. That's why the table looks like this. And I have a definition of all my columns. The first column, it contains links to the product detail page. So if you click on it, you will go to the product/17, and this URL is generated by the route link. So I have the route name product detail, and I'm supplying a parameter called ID, and you can bind your records or your values to this parameter, and I'm using product name as a text of the link. If I look in the DotvvmStartup, you can see that this route is registered like this. So the URL is product/ID in curly braces, which means that it's a parameter. And it's optional because if I want to create a new product, I will just say product/ and nothing. And it's going to the same page, which can handle updates and inserts, but it works. Yeah. So this is the template column. I can provide my own content for the table cell. And then there are just text columns which can just render some value. So I'm rendering category name, supplier name, quantities, orders on order, and units on order, and things like that. So these are the text columns. Basically just take the value from the ViewModel object and render it as it is. For everything else, I can use the template field, template column. Yeah. And here, this new product button is just a route link. It goes to the same URL, but I'm not specifying the param ID property. So it will just use empty ID, which means that it will go to just /product. Yeah. So the parameters is optional. So in this case, it's not supplied. And there is the data pager, which is doing all the paging. So if you just bind it to the same collection as GridView, it will do the paging over this collection. So let's look in the ViewModel. I have a property called products, and it's of type GridView dataset of product list model. Product list model, let me show it to you, is just a plain C# class, and it contains all the columns I will be displaying in the GridView. This class is specific to this page. If I would display some other products elsewhere in the application, there is a high chance that I would need to display different columns. So it's a good idea to create a model object for every page, because it's much more efficient when there are only the fields you really need in the page. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the ViewModel is serialized in JSON. So if I would place there 100 columns and I was using only 10 of them, then it means that I would transfer a lot of unnecessary data to the client. So it's a good idea to not pollute ViewModels and model objects with data you actually don't need. Yeah, so that's just a best practice. And so this is the GridView dataset of product list model, and I can specify some configuration to it. So there are paging options, and I'm saying page size, and there are also sorting options. There is a sort expression. I want to sort by product name. I'm using this fancy C# name of operator. There is also sort descending, or yeah, so if I would set it to true, it would sort in reverse order. And so that's my data set. And if you want to work with the data set, it's quite easy, because in the pre-render method, which is used for querying the database, I am asking, is refresh required? Data set has this Boolean flag that indicates whether you need to refresh your data or not. Because if you don't change anything in the data set, there's no need to query the database over and over. And on the first request, this will be true, and when I load it, it will reset to false. If I change, for example, the filters, or if I choose different page or change the order, this would get set to true automatically. So it's a good thing to check on this flag before you do the loading, because otherwise you would be loading unnecessary, you would ask the database even if it's not necessary. So I have my product service, which is my business layer, or maybe some just service class or something like that. If you look in this, I'm asking for this class in the constructor. So I'm using dependency injection. It works pretty naturally in DotVVM. And enable to use the product service like this, you just need to register it in the startup. So the same way as I register DotVVM and entity framework and these things, I can also register my application services. So this is my product service, and I'm registering it as scoped, which means that I will get a separate instance for every HTTP request. Yeah. So I will get the instance of product service in the constructor, and I'm storing it in a read-only field. And this is also quite clever advantage of knowing how DotVVM works, because the ViewModel is serialized into JSON, And this is a service class. I don't need it on the client. There's no way how it could work. It only provides some functions. But I don't want it to be a part of the view model on the client. So I declare it intentionally as a field. Yeah, so everything you will need on the client, make a public property. Everything you don't want to give to the client, make it as a private field, and you should be safe. So all these dependencies I get from the constructor, I declare as read-only fields. And it doesn't have to be read-only, but it has to be a field. And I'm asking for getProducts query, and I'm passing a filter, which is another model class, and I'm just filtering by some text, or I want to show only the available products. So this is this UI. Yeah, so this is the search text, this is the available only. And again, if I would add some filters later, it's practical to have this model object even if there are just two properties, because I will be able to add more filter criteria, and I don't need to change anything else in my view model because I'm just passing one object. This getProducts query, it's just using entity framework, so I'm asking for Northwind context in the constructor, and then I'm going to the products collection, products table, and applying the filters. If it's available, I will just use where units in stock is greater than 0. I'm using the EF functions like for filtering by some search text. So if I enter some text for searching, it would work. And then I'm projecting the model objects from the product. So I'm not passing entity framework entities to the view model. I don't like to do it because they can be much more columns than I actually need in the view model. So that's why I'm creating my own model objects. So I'm using select and asking for those data. And for example, this is useful because I can just ask for category name and entity framework will produce the join for me. So I don't need to include the entire category, which also has 20 other columns I don't need. I can just ask for category name and supplier company name. And if you don't like writing so much code, I recommend to use AutoMapper. Use it carefully because it's a very nice tool, but it can also cause issues if you try to ask for too much of it. But for these simple transform, like from a collection of entities, create a collection of these models, it's a perfect tool and it can save you these lines. You would just say products, project to product list model, and you are done. Yeah. So that's it. And as you can see, I'm not doing any sorting or paging here. I'm just doing filtering, because sorting and paging is handled by the GridView dataset for me. Yeah, so I just get all the records, no matter on which page and by which I'm sorting, and I just say products load from queryable, and it will read the sorting and paging information from the dataset and apply that to the iQueryable before evaluating the query. So if you look at the SQL, which is going to the database, you will see that I'm asking only for the 15 records on the third page sorted by product name, and all those things will happen at the database level. And if you don't use entity framework, you can just manually fill this information in the dataset. There is the items collection, it's normal list, and if you are getting your objects from using any other way, you can just fill this items collection with your objects. Don't forget to set paging options total items count to the total number of records that match the filter criteria, because the data pager control will render the appropriate number of pages. Yeah, so it needs to know the total number of records, otherwise it wouldn't know how many these links should be here. And also you should reset this flag manually, because the dataset cannot know that you have tampered with those properties. So after you're done, you can mark that refresh has been done and nobody else needs refresh. Okay, and finally the filtering. I have collapsed this section so it wouldn't scare us at the beginning, but right now I have the Bootstrap well which is doing this fancy border and background. And I'm using the form, inline version of the form. And I have the search products label and the text box, so I'm searching. And as you can see, there is the data context bound to the filter model. So I can remind how the filter looks. It's an object in the view model, and it has search text and available only. And thanks to the data context, this says that all data bindings in this form element will be evaluated on the filter, not on the view model of the entire page. Yeah, so this is how you can use data context to restrict the UI to work only with some tiny part of the view model. Yeah, so right now I can say search text and it's bound to the filter, yeah, and also available only. But there is a button, apply filters, which needs to refresh the data, refresh the results that will be displayed in the query. And the apply filter is not in this filter, it's in the parent. It's in the product list view model. So I can use underscore parent to get away from this scope. So I can get one level up, one data context up. And there is also underscore root. And because right now I have only two scopes, this filter and the root scope, it will do the same thing. But in a more complicated scenarios, the parent is different than the root. So always decide if you want to use with parent or with root, because if I would use data context, for example, here, I could break my bindings here. So this is a little decision you need to make. In this case, it doesn't really matter, but if you wrap this into another section with different data context, then it will become important. And again, this is also using the isSubmit button property. This is just a syntax trigger. You can say equals true, but you don't need to specify this. If there is no value to the attribute, it's treated as a true. And if it's submit button, the good thing is that if you are in this controls and press enter, it will just trigger this button. Yeah, so that's why it's submit button, because I can go here, I can say A for example, and press enter. And sorry, I have been changing the application, so let's refresh this. Oh yeah, it takes a little bit time because I have changed some part of the C# code, so it recompiled the application, so that's why it took a few seconds. But I can do it once more. Now the application is loaded, it's living, so I can say AA and press enter, and now it's immediate. So it was just the first request to the application which was slow. Sorry about that. Yeah, and also I can use the only in stock. So for example, now you can see that the data are changing here. Yeah. So that's the grid view. So to recap, we have the grid view dataset, which is basically a clever collection which remembers on which page you are and by which column you are sorting, knows the page size and things like that. And I have a function that returns me iQueryable of my model objects. So it's iQueryable of product list model. And I'm saying products load from queryable, pass the queryable, and the dataset will do paging and sorting for me. So I don't need to do anything else. In the apply filters, I just say products request refresh, which basically sets this is request required to true. And because the pre-render happens after the commands from the buttons, this is also quite a nice way, because this will be called first and then this will be true, so it will do the reload. And again, if there are multiple reasons why you want to do a reload, thanks to the fact that this doesn't do a query in the database, it's just setting the is refresh required to true. So in this case, it's also very efficient, because if there are 5 changes that all need to refresh the data in the grid, it will happen only once if you put this in the pre-render method. Of course, if you would load from queryable here, then if there is something else why you need to refresh the data, it will be on 2 queries. But this pattern is also quite nice, because no matter how many things change in the page, any change can trigger this request refresh, and before I'm rendering the page, I will just load the data no matter if it's requested once or 10 times, it doesn't matter. Okay, so this is the grid, and I also have a detail page here. I can edit some product. So you can see it's a basic, quite simple Bootstrap form. Thanks to Bootstrap CSS, it looks nice. And so let's look at the markup. First, there is the title, and you can see that some expressions are supported in the value binding. You cannot do everything, but the basic expressions work. Don't try to call functions in the value binding, because there's not many functions which DotVVM can translate to JavaScript, because this needs to be translated to JavaScript. If anybody changes this is new to another value, this binding would re-evaluate on the client side. But in this case, this question mark and colon operator is supported. Form data context, and again you can see that in this form we will be binding only to current product, which is again its product detail model. So it's another model object, and I'm binding to this object. If the object is not new, if it's updating current record, then this section will be visible. In DotVVM you can add visible to any element, and if you use binding, this section would be shown or hidden based on the value. So if is new is false, in this case the section will be visible. The difference is that if I'm editing, you can see the section is here, and if I would switch to insert, the section disappears because the visible is false. So you can hide or show any part of the page using this. Yeah. Then we have the name, and you can see there is just a text box bound to product name. Product name is a property in the product detail model in the current product. Yeah, so that's just this. I have combo boxes here for picking the category and supplier. Yeah, so for example, you can select a category, you can select suppliers, and this is a little bit complicated, but not so much, hopefully. So the combo box has the data source property, and it's bound to a collection. As you can see from the tooltip, it's a list of category picker model, and if you look here, you can see it's just a list. No need to use GridView dataset here because we are not sorting and paging the list of categories. And there is just a category ID and category name. In the database there are more columns to the category, but again, I don't want to pollute the view model with things I don't need, so I'm having only those two properties I actually need in my model object. Yeah. So that's it. And because this list of categories is never changed on this page, we'll just load it from the database, and there is no way how user can add new categories on this page. There can be some other pages where the user can add categories, but not here. So in this case, I can say bind server to client first request. It means that on the first GET request, this collection will be downloaded to the client, and when the user is doing postbacks, is clicking buttons, the collection will stay on the client. It will not be sent to the server because the server doesn't need it. It can always load it from the database, and there is no need to push these non-changing data then and forth. Yeah, so this is basically optimization of the network transfers. The same applies to suppliers. So these are two collections. And when I go back to the combo box, so I'm binding to the collection, and I need to say that the category name property will be displayed. So that's the labels you can see in this list. Yeah, so that's the category name property. And the item value binding means that when I select some category, its ID will be written to some ViewModel property. And this is this category ID ViewModel property. And this is a little bit confusing because both bindings look the same. This is category ID, this is category ID, but these data bindings has different data context because Combobox is changing the context to the items of this data source. So this is category name of the category picker model, and this is category ID of the product detail model. If you look at the tooltip, you can see then the class in which the property is different. So and it's pretty natural because, of course, if you specify the property of the list item, you want the binding to happen on another object than writing the result value. But anyway, in the product detail model, the selected category ID will be written into the category ID of the product detail model, so it will work. Exactly the same situation is with suppliers, so it's the same. Again, it's a Combobox control, and selected value is going to the supplier ID property. And then there are some text boxes, so quantity per unit, units in stock, units on order, all of them are just text boxes. And I'm using validation here, so that's what, for example, this control does. It's a validation summary, and basically it will take all the validation errors from this screen, exactly from this validation target, so from underscore this, which is the product detail model. If there is something else in the page that could be validated apart from the current product, it won't be displayed here. So validation target allows you to select the scope of your validation. And then I have the save button and cancel button. Okay, let's try the validation. When I try to create new product and don't fill anything, this is how the validation summary looks like. Basically, it's just rendering an unordered list. Your responsibility is to provide CSS so it would look nice. I have used just the text danger CSS class, which makes everything red. It's enough for me, but of course your graphic people would think that maybe more sophisticated approach is needed for this scenario. And also you may see that I have also changed the text box color to red, and there is also the tooltip. Yeah, the product name field is required. So how this is done? It's first let's look in the model object. So if I go to the current product and go to product detail model, you can see there is the product ID, and all those other fields are marked with the required attribute. It's from system component model data annotations, so it's a standard .NET framework way of validating things. And basically I'm using the required validation here, and also for the numbers I'm also using the range validation, so it should be from 0 to 999. Yeah. So this is the validation rules, and .vvm by default on every button it checks for all validation errors. So if there is the button and I click on the save method wouldn't even be called if there is any validation error in the page. So by default the validation is turned on. You can turn it off, so you can say validation enabled equals false, or you can say validation target and say, okay, I will be validating, but not the entire page. I will only validate some part of the page. For example, this, which is the current product, because I'm still in this data context. Yeah, I'm still in the current product. Yeah, so this is what I can do. There is nothing else in the view model apart of this current product, so it doesn't matter if the validation target is actually here but not. But you can use validation target to validate only some part of the page. And if I would not use route link for canceling, because I don't need to do anything in cancel, I just want to go to the previous page, so this is route link. But if it's a button, there it would make sense to do validation enabled equals false, because if you cancel and not saving anything, you don't need to ask the user to make all the values in the form really valid. So this is how the validation is triggered. When you click the save button, by default entire page is going to be validated. So that's why this validation summary will trigger. And also there is a way for .vvm to mark some elements or assign some properties to some elements and do some actions when the validation error appear. So for example, this div around the text box has the validator value set to product name. So if this field is not valid, then this div element is marked and some action will happen. And there is a way to configure these actions. So for example, I can say validator.invalidCSS class has error, which means that if this property is an invalid, this div will get this has error CSS class. DotVVM will just add this class using JavaScript to this element. And also I can say validator.setTooltipText to true, which means that the div will get this tooltip when you hover the mouse on it. Okay, but of course all the fields will have the same validation rules, so it would be quite stupid to repeat those two features on every form field, because this is a very simple page, but there are 6 form fields and I really don't want to write this everywhere. So in DotVVM, some properties like these validation things can be specified not on the element itself, but they can be specified on their parents. So I could set them to this form group, or I could set them to this entire form, and it would apply to all elements which have validator value set. Or because I want the entire application to look consistent, I have just specified these properties here in the master page on the body element. So basically this is set up globally. So whenever I assign validator.value to any element, it will take this behavior from master page. So it will get the hasError CSS class and it will set the tooltip text. Right. So this is how you can display the validation. And if you would like to display a validation message, for example, you can also use .validatorControl, and you can say just value equals property to be validated. So this is the product ID, and show error message text equals true, which will grab the validation error and display it here. And of course you can say you can use a CSS class, so it will be CSS class will be text danger and the validation message will be red. Yeah, so this is how you would display this error message for this field. But I don't want to do that because I have validation summary here at the bottom of the form. So this is sufficient for me. And when you click the save, you just you can see that I am not doing any kind of business logic in the view model. I'm just saying product service save and let the business layer to do all the things. I'm just giving it my detail model. And on the pre-render, if it's first page load, which means that context is postback is false, I'm filling the categories and suppliers fields, so the combo boxes will have their data sources populated. And then if it's new record, I'm just initializing the model to a new instance, so there is just empty model with empty fields. And if it's an existing product, I'm using the ID property and to load the information, and the ID is marked with the from route attribute, which means that DotVVM will look in the route for the ID parameter, and if it's there, it will set it to this property. So I will be able to find the ID in this property. And this new property is just a read-only one, so you can see this expression body syntax here. And basically, if ID is 0, which means that there was nothing in the route, then it's a new record. If it's non-zero, it means that it's not a new record. It means that I'm editing some of the records. Okay, so this is how it works, and that's how I can create a detail page in DotVVM. Okay. One important thing, if you will start with DotVVM, you can very soon run into the situation that the view model is quite long, because it's doing a lot of things Yeah, if the page is complicated, you can have a lot of properties and a lot of methods in your view models. The key rule is to keep the view models simple and sane. So the first thing you might find useful is to separate properties by their kind, because the page you have just seen has different kinds of data in the view model. Something is the main data, which we are focusing on. So for the product detail page, it's the product itself. So there is the current product property, which holds the main data. And if you look in this property again, you can see that there are only the fields that are really needed in the page. Yeah, so product name, category ID, supplier ID, quantity, and etc. Nothing else, so no clutter, just the things the user is going to change. Yeah, so that's the main data. Then there are some properties that are just indicating in which state the page should be. Yeah, so for example, it's the isNew property, because it's just a read-only flag that tells the page, okay, you are in the insert mode or you are in the edit mode. Yeah, so this is, and it's not stored anywhere. It's just a state information about the page itself. And then we have some ambient values that basically we cannot change, but they are given to us from some other parts of the application. For example, the ID, the current record ID, it goes from the route. There is no way how the page itself can change it. It could only redirect to the same page with different ID, but it gets the ID from the route and there is no way to change it. Also, since the user is not able to change the category and supplier list on this page, I also treat this as ambient values. Typically, the ambient values can only have the getter. They don't need to be writable. So that's the isNew. There is no setter. This means that there will be only getter. Or they can be marked with the server to client first request, because we just need to deliver them to the client. And if there is no way for them to be changed, then we don't need to send them to the server and back. So you can optimize the data transfers using this bind attribute. Then it's very useful to keep the main data of the page as one object, because right now there are 6 fields, and if the application will grow and I will listen to all the requirements from my user, it's probable that in 2 years the form will have 50 fields. And if you place all the information right in the view model, so for example, I would have the product name, category ID here in the view model and not in my detail object, in my model object, then it would be problematic, because I would need to, when I'm loading the data, I would need to set 10 properties here or 50 properties here, and I would need to pass 50 parameters to this function. If it's in the model object, it's much easier, because I am just, when I need to add a new field, I will just add it to the product detail. I won't need to go through the entire view model and look where I'm working with the other properties and add my lines of code. Yeah, so this also makes the thing simple, and it also quite nicely separates the business logic of the presentation logic, because the view model really doesn't need to care which properties are in the model. For the view model, this is the model of the project, and which fields we will display, it's the view responsibility, and what we will be saving and loading, it's the business layer responsibility. Because view model is basically passing the data from the business layer to the UI and back. So it doesn't need to understand everything that's happening with the data. Yeah. So this is keeping the view model simple. And thanks to this, the view model will be shorter and cleaner. Also, you should take advantage of nesting. If the page, for example, has multiple logical sections that are basically independent on each other, it makes sense to create separate view models from them from the beginning. Not do it later, because later it can be much more complicated. Every view model will have some dependencies and you will have to tear those apart. It's easier to start with tiny view models for each logical section, and then have a one view model that will only contain the login and register objects, and these will be the nested view models, basically the child view models. Yeah, so if the page has multiple independent sections, make sure you create a separate view model for each one, and the page view model will be really simple because it will just have two properties, the login view model and register view model. Yeah. DotVVM supports this scenario, and if these child view models inherit from DotVVM view model base, they will also have the init, load, and pre-render methods, so you can override pre-render method in the login and in the register, and they will be totally independent. DotVVM will call them both, but they don't need to know about each other. They are completely separate. Also, there is the context property in the view models. For example, you can ask context to do redirects, context.redirect to route, or you can ask if it's a postback or if it's not a postback, and there is a lot of other things in the context, and both child view models will get their context property set also by DotVVM, so you don't need to pass your context from the parent view model to child. One note for this place maybe, view models need to be JSON serializable, as I mentioned, which means that parents should know about the children, but the children shouldn't have a property, something like parent view model, because it would create a dependency cycle, and JSON doesn't like cycles. Yeah, so avoid referencing the parent from the child view models, and I will show a trick how to do it in a couple of minutes. Even the nested view models can use dependency injection, and we will also see this in a while. And also there is a trick if you want, for example, to create a model dialog. This is a special case, and you also want to have nested view model for model dialog. Yeah, so the contents of the window should have its own view model. It's quite common that customers at the beginning, they want this part of the page to be a model dialog, and then it gets more and more complicated, and there is a lot of content, so you will probably move the model dialog to a separate page eventually. So if you have a separate view model for it from the beginning, it's very easy to just remove the model dialog and move this to separate page, because it will have its own self-contained view model. Yeah. So if you are creating model dialogs, in 100% cases, create an independent view model for the dialog, because in the future it can only help you. If you want to create a model dialog, it's quite easy to do with DotVVM. You have seen the visible property, so you can, for example, create a div, set its visible property to is dialog open or something like that, and use a few CSS classes to make it look like a model dialog, so it will cover the page and it will display the content centered to the with some position fixed and things like that in CSS. Also, you can use the data context. There is a special feature of data context in DotVVM. If the data context is null, the element will be hidden and removed from the page. And whenever the value returns to the data context, when you set something else than null, the element will be recreated back. So you can also show and hide the model dialog using the data context. So you would have some dialog view model property in your view model, and you would set it to some object which will display the dialog. And then if you want to close it, you just set it to null. And because the data context of the model dialog will be null, it will be hidden. Yeah, so this is a clever use of data context. You can find this also quite useful. If you don't want to write your own model dialogs, we have model dialogs controls in our commercial products, so you can use Bootstrap for DotVVM or Business Pack. Both these packages contain the model dialog control. And in these controls, there is the isDisplayed property on the dialog, so you can use Boolean property to show or hide the dialog. Let's look how to create your own dialog. So I don't want to convince you to buy our commercial products. So in this page, I have my own dialog, and it's embedded like a user control. So let's look how it's defined. I've created a controls folder, and there is a reorder dialog control. Yeah. So it's also .dot.html file. It has different extension. There is dot control, and you can use, I'm using Bootstrap CSS classes, so you even don't need to write your own CSS. You can use Bootstrap. So I'm using modal fade in, and visible is dialog open. So I'm binding the visibility of this div element to is dialog open property in the view model. Yeah. And the dialog has its own view model. So there is the is dialog open. There is the quantity to reorder, because the model dialog will contain one main data field. And there is also the product ID. Let's look how it works first. So you can imagine I have some special route products too in this application. And when you click reorder in this row, a model dialog will appear. And I can say reorder 10 items. And when I click reorder product, the dialog disappears and this value will be changed. So I'll do it once again. Focus on this value, units on order 57. And when I add additional 3, it should change to 60. Yeah? So how this is done? So I have created my own control. There is a template for it, so you can use add new item. And you can say ASP.NET Core web.vvm. And there is the user control, so you can name it, and it will create a user control for you. And because it's a model dialog, I have created a view model for this dialog. I'm inheriting from DotVVM-ViewModel base, so I can use the init load pre-render methods. And I'm also using dependency injection, so I'm injecting product service in the constructor of this child view model. And there are methods like show dialog, which needs the product ID because the dialog needs to remember for which product I'm reordering items. So I can just store this product ID to my property, product ID. So this is just to keep the context of the model dialog. So I know that for which product I'm reordering. And I'm resetting the quantity to reorder to 1. And I set is dialog open to true, which will display the UI. Then there is the hide dialog, which is basically this cancel button. So if I click cancel, it will call the hide dialog method. And I'm just setting is dialog open to false, so it will disappear. And there is the reorder method, which is bound to this button. And when I click it, there's a lot of things happening. Because I'm calling my business logic to do the actual reorder. So it will look in the database, it will increase the units on order item, it can do some validation checks and things like that. Then I need to hide the dialog, and then I need to refresh the grid. And because I said that this child dialog view model should not keep a reference to its parent, because it's hard to serialize this, in this case, I'm using event because it's excluded from the JSON. Events do not serialize. And the parent will listen to this event. And when I fire this event, the parent can do any action. For example, refresh the grid, which is what I will be doing. So instead of asking the parent to refresh the grid view directly, I'm just firing this reorder completed event. Yeah, so it's public event, it's action, it doesn't have any parameters, it doesn't need them actually. So I'm just calling reorder completed invoke, and this event will just be handled by the product list view model. And in the constructor you can see I'm asking also for the child view model. So the dependency injection will create the child view model for me, and I'm just setting it to the reorder dialog property. And when the child dialog fires this event, I'm just saying, okay, refresh my grid view. Yeah. This is the way how you can achieve not having a reference to parent in the child view models. And also you will avoid all the serialization issues because the events are excluded from the serialization. That's why also you need to hook on these events in the constructor, because if you do a post back and you wouldn't rehook this event, it would be lost. Yeah. So this is how the view models can basically communicate with each other, because parent can call the child, because the children are referenced as a property, but the child, if the child needs to communicate with the parent, it's a nice way to use events. Okay, so that's it. And when in the page, when we need to display the dialog, it's as easy as using a link button. I want it to look like a hyperlink, so that's link button. And I'm just saying, okay, now I'm in the grid view, so I need to go one scope up. So I would get out of the products collection, and I'm going to reorder dialog, show dialog, and I'm passing the current product ID, which is stored in the model dialog view model. So on the next post back, the model dialog will know which product has been selected in the previous step. Yeah, that's why you need to store this state in the view model. And here I'm using the reorder dialog control from my controls directory, and I'm setting DataContext to just the child view model of the dialog. Yeah, so the DataContext is reorder dialog, and that's it. Okay, and one last thing, if you want to use the controls, don't forget to register those controls in DotvvmStartup. I'm using config markup, add markup control, and I'm registering my reorder dialog, which is in this path. There is also auto-register strategy for these controls. So there is something like auto-discover controls. So you could just point them to the directory and it would discover all controls in the directory. So if you don't want to register all of them one by one, you can use this strategy. Okay. So some useful tips. Because the view models are written in the C#, then it's also easy to use the base classes and with generics and things like that. So if your application should contain hundreds of these grid detail pages, you will find out that it's quite easy to create a base class, for example, grid page view model, detail page view model, with some generic parameters for the data models. You can also very soon find that you can write a model dialog base class for all the model dialogs, because all the model dialogs will probably have the show and hide features, so that can be implemented in your base class. And there are some questions in the chat. What happens if there is already a reorder completed function added to the reorder dialog? Reorder completed plus equal statement. I'm not sure if I follow. Maybe. I hope that I understand the question correctly. But in this case, the events in .NET can have multiple subscribers. So if more places in the view model subscribe to the same event, it doesn't matter. They all will be notified. So if you want to do one thing based on this event and then do another thing based on this event, you can just subscribe multiple times. And if there is no subscriber on this event, then if you would call it like this, you would get null reference exception. That's why I'm using the exclamation, the question mark, to do this. And there is a follow-up question: would two functions get executed? Yes, they will, and they should execute in the order of their subscriptions, I hope. But it's a natural part of .NET runtime, so this should work. It's in the .NET from the first version, so I hope it's already tested enough. So, but yeah, all the subscribers will get executed. So two functions will get executed. And because every HTTP request has its own instance of the view model, then it wouldn't collide for multiple users. If there are multiple concurrent users, every user will have its own their own instance of the view model, so there should be no conflicts in this. And the subscriptions are not serialized, so when you get the same view model coming back from the client, this will be empty. Okay, so hopefully I have answered the question. If you have any other questions, follow us in the chat under the video so you can ask anything. We'll be watching the conversation. Okay, so don't be afraid of creating base classes. If your application is going to be larger, you will see that there is a lot of repeating stuff in the view models. So use all the features that C# language is giving to you, because it can make your life much easier. If you want to work with collections in the view model, we have some controls for it. You have seen already the GridView and GridView dataset. You can also use just IEnumerable or lists, so the classic .NET collections. Also, checkbox control has a nice feature for working with collections. Very often in my web apps, I needed a collection of checkboxes to just select multiple IDs. For example, I had a list of countries somewhere and I wanted to let the user select countries he has been visited or something like that. It's quite easy to do with checkbox, because there is the checked items property, which you can point to collection of any objects, or in this case I'm using strings, and then specify a checked value, which means that when you check this specific checkbox, this checked value will be added into this collection. Yeah. And also, if you uncheck it, it will be removed from this collection. And it's two-way, so if anyone in the view model changes this collection, the checkboxes will respond to this. So if they find their own value in the collection, they will make themselves checked. If they don't find this value, they will uncheck themselves. Yeah, so it's two-way, and it's very easy to, for example, allow selection of colors. So if I click on those two checkboxes, I will have red and green strings in this collection. If you use any other type than string, you should use value binding here, because if you use just this hard-coded value, it will be treated as string. So if you want to use numbers, you can use value colon and, for example, 1 or something like that, because this will be evaluated as integer. You can find more information in the documentation, and there are also examples how you can use the checkbox control. Also, what's a quite nice feature in DotVVM we have added quite recently is dynamic CSS classes. I have been using a lot of web technologies, web forms, MVC, React, Angular, and in a lot of them I had to when I had to combine several classes based on some conditions, I get two expressions like that. So there is some ternary operator, and if it's active, I'm adding this active, then I need to add space, because you should separate those classes by spaces. If it's past event, I will add some other substring, and so on, so on. And this is crazy complicated, crazy long. And in .vvm, we are using a thing called property groups, which means that if you use class dash and name of the CSS class, then you can use a simple Boolean expression. So if this is true, the element will get the active class. If this is false, this class would be removed from the element. And also, it would work on the client side. So if under this, if you would have, for example, checkbox bound to is active, so if you click the checkbox, the change will be propagated immediately, so the div will get the active class. And if there are multiple classes, they will be concatenated and separated with the space, so it will work. So this is a very nice feature. It can simplify these long expressions. So to recapitulate, view models should be clean and simple. If it's too long, do not be afraid of splitting it into multiple pieces. You should use nesting wherever possible, because all the applications tend to grow, and even if it's a simple screen with 3 fields, in few years there will be 30 fields. And if you at the beginning, if you think how the application could evolve and split the view models from the beginning, it's easier to do than do later, because you need to track who is using which property, and it gets a little bit messy. If you are using nesting, take advantage of the data context, use data context to separate or to reflect the logical structure of the view model in the UI. So if there is a piece or a part of the page which is working with a specific part of the view model, use the data context so the bindings are simplified. And also, in some cases, you may want to use the data context null feature. So if you set the data context to null, the part of the page will just disappear. And it can reappear again whenever you set the value back to the property. And if you have multiple properties in the view model, think about what they actually mean. If it's the main page data, if it's some just state information for the user interface, or if it's some ambient value which is static and which never gets changed. It's easier to separate these things and not to combine them together, because typically you will pass this information to different places. So it's easy to, it's a good idea to keep those things in one object, so you don't have 20 different properties in the view model. Okay, so here is another screen with the links. I have already shown it there, also posted in the chat. So the homepage .vvm.com, documentation.vvm.com/docs, and github.com Riganti.vvm is our GitHub repo. Also, if you are curious about finding out which controls have which properties and what features they offer, if you go to the documentation, I hope that my internet connection is working. You can find a control reference section there, and there is a list of all controls we have with some samples and things like that. So hopefully that will work. I think that my internet has just broken, so I will not wait for it to load. I will post some links in the chat. Okay?